Good evening, friends. And it's very reassuring to be able to see you all here and welcome you at the start of our activities for MARG this year. I want to thank the IIC very much for allowing us to be able to use this space and for supporting us all these years. MARG is no stranger to most of you. Started in 1946 by Mulk Raja Anand and several other well-wishers who together did extraordinary work to be able to imagine what independent India would need as a post-colonial vision, what kind of policy would govern the kind of institutions that would run Indian art and culture. This required immediately an urgent documentation of the history of India's art and culture. Because how could you really have a vision if you didn't know what existed and what you were creating a vision for? We also have to remember that a substantial part of the intelligentsia didn't really have material available in the English language for them to be able to access that was written by authors who were willing to take a more post-colonial stance at that kind of writing. And so a major project was initiated by the Modern Architectural Review Group, which is what they called themselves initially, till they dispensed with that acronym a few years later, and just began to be called MARG, a path maker. Over the past 75 years, the disciplines that MARG has built up have themselves changed and grown. What was considered highly academic once ended up becoming general knowledge. New specializations have emerged, shifts in our imperatives with which we now look upon culture. So that very documentation that was done with one set of imperatives serves as a rich ground for new types of analysis today. Like India, MARG has also completed 75 years, and 75 is probably a good age to take stock. So many of you present here today have been avid supporters, writers, editors, and trustees of MARG who have helped shaped MARG's life and discourse. 2022 was a big year for us all. The COVID years forced a re-reckoning of where we stand, an opportunity, once again, to take stock. MARG was entrusted in 2022 to a new editor, me, and a new management team. To chart what MARG can do, what direction to take now, required an assessment of what it has left out. What are the kind of things that MARG should now be paying attention to? And why were those things left out? It also required a little bit of a pat on its back to be able to acknowledge and stand its ground for what it has achieved, and how the subject which it has fostered has itself transformed and grown. And so we decided editorially to come up with 5 volumes, which are readers or readings. The first of which was Temples, and you can see the Temples volume opens with quotations from the writings of Mulk Raja Anand, which really put into focus what were the kinds of issues that MARG stood for. So the first one, for instance, ever since its inception, MARG has sought to make a new kind of critical approach toward Indian artworks. We do not think that we have succeeded in changing the trend of Indian art criticism amongst all our contributors. But we did put forward overtly and by implication certain hypotheses which are beginning to be shared among a number of students, especially the younger generation, so that there has been a visible and clear shift of emphasis from the old criticism to the new criticism, he said in 1965, taking stock at one stage. And I think we reached, as I was saying, a point of taking stock again. As early as 55, taking a vision for Marg forward, and that's one of the opening first Marg's covers. As the discovery of India proceeds, as we make efforts to inherit our past culture, we begin to realize that the gaps in our knowledge of the various historical periods are almost as vast as the centuries through which our ancient culture was built up. So with that as an opening salvo and mandate for what Marg was going to do, you can imagine why there were so many new Margs that came out that were path-breaking in terms of the documentation that they offered. So the first of the volumes that came out on readings was the one called Readings on the Temple. And I'll give you a little introduction to that presently. The second one is Readings on Textiles, which we're here to celebrate today. The third one, which is imminent, is Readings on Dance, and I'm delighted to see Anita Cherian, one of its co-editors, and Urmimala Sarkar Munshi, who isn't here with us, who are going to be guest editing that volume. The one after that will be on the Readings on the Advent of the Modern, which is going to look at a decisive period between 1870 to 1970, and the transformations that went on, and how Marg has dealt with those transformations, which deals, in fact, with the very creation of Marg itself in the middle of all of that. That's going to be guest edited by Shukla Savant. And then the next one that's going to come out, the last of the volumes on readings will be on Indian miniature painting, or traditional Indian painting, which is being jointly co-edited by Yael Rice and Deepthi Khera. And after that, through this process of reckoning, what we are also being able to pull together is a vision for what the new Margs are going to endeavor and the kind of subjects that they're going to take on, and the kind of things that they have left out all these years which we need to cover up on. Each of these readers is designed to present the field from a contemporary lens. Some colleagues have written in to say how useful it has turned as a teaching tool to be able to design courses around these new frames. We can't really be comprehensive in the volumes that we have, because Marg has covered so much, and yet it has left out so much. There are so many things that one felt, or writers whose works had to be précised, or had to be given as a synoptic form or as a photo essay. But luckily, COVID years have opened up another way of publishing, which has been the digital. And so there are handy digital links which are provided with every one of the essays, which acts as a kind of a directory that can lead the reader or the student or the teacher to reading a full essay on the Marg archive pages. There are surprising shifts in the way in which we approach these subjects. So the opening line, for instance, on the Readings on the Temple, is that temples were not made only for Hindus. That's the way we start the book, because there is this a priori presumption always that that's the way the subject should be. It's a volume that explains and looks at the way in which new subjects are being opened up from Buddhist temples and Jain temples, to the idea that temples are not just located in India, and how do we deal with the ones in Balochistan or the ones in Southeast Asia? Do we pat ourselves on the back and say, oh, look, Indian culture has spread so far into Southeast Asia, while we ourselves are singing a parallel tune of decolonization? How can we assert cultural hegemony on Southeast Asia when you yourself want autonomy and want to be rid of that narrative for yourselves? How do you deal with the contentious issue of Nepal? Where do you position its architecture? And so we had essays which are all prefaced by the editor's comments on what is the value of that kind of research, and how do we think about that kind of writing, which was done in the 1940s to the 1990s, and what kind of politics guided that kind of writing at that time. So a kind of historiography of the subject builds up. There are also surprising things to be able to document the variety that exists in the field. And that's where MARG really has a lot in its archive, because it has produced volumes that look at no one singular way of thinking about even something like what is a temple. And so we have Ukrainian architecture, which has influenced the creation of buildings of Hindu temples in Goa. And you have other remarkable kinds of architecture, which are all part of what is regarded as the normative kind of Hindu temple in those parts of India. So there were surprising revelations that came out of the documentation. There are eminent historians and writers who have contributed through the history of MARG to its archive, and it was a great pleasure to be able to showcase their work. One of the issues that has always been there in temples, for instance, is that the earliest temples were supposed to be in caves. But are they really? Or are those exceptions? In the 1990s, Vidya Deheja edited an extraordinary volume for temple architecture in MARG, which was on patronage. And that was a particularly valuable one, because from that came a new way of thinking about temples, and the concerns of temple art and architecture totally shifted. And so issues of patronage become another chapter in the volume. And then, of course, we come to modern architecture. What are the concerns that modern architects must be aware of when selecting a sacred site? And how do they uphold the idea of tradition while also thinking in terms of contemporary design? Temples were, until a certain point, only limited to be visited by members of upper castes. So what role did temple festivals play in public participation? And so major sociological questions start getting asked as to whose temples is it that we are really studying? Are we only studying temple art and icons for upper caste India? Or are we also going to look at the temple culture as a place where there is water and access to water harvesting, and access to public participation, communal kitchens? What of the response to and relationship with other kinds of arts that were active at the time? What do we make of how do you explain all the erotic imagery that exists on temple walls? And what, as I was saying, is the history of these sites? How have they radically transformed while coming into the contemporary period? And so the MARG's archive was particularly rich on another front, which were the radical changes that have taken place in temple art and architecture ever since the 13th century. Whereas most course textbooks on Hindu temple art and architecture tend to end the discourse with the Vijayanagar Empire in about the 14th century, here is a refreshing change, because you can look at the temples that were made in the 16th, 17th, 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries as well. And in each period, you see what is the extent of the changes and the fashions that have come into the field of temple art and architecture. Another revelation in the book is the reason why people made temples. Not just because there was a sacred tirth of old that had to be worshipped, but because they were often memorial sites. And this brings the discourse with tomb architecture and temple architecture onto the same platform. And so the defining divide that exists between Islamic architecture being a tomb-based architecture and Hindu temple architecture being celebrating a god rather than being commemorative also dissolves. So there are extraordinary studies that exist in these volumes. Perhaps one of the most interesting one was Arnath's old study of the Bhitargaon temple with its Byzantine arches. Who knew that temples were being made with true arches, voussoir architecture, as early as the Gupta period, but with the idea not having come from Indo-Islamic art, but having actually come from a correlationship with Byzantine architecture at a much older period. Colonial patronage, reformation and change, restoration of temples, the concept of Jirnodhar, temples that exist without a sacred icon within them. What are the nature of the rituals that empower these temples? And how do we deal with the lot of the temple makers, the craftsmen, the people, the artists who worked at those sites, have all become major sociological concerns linked with temple culture today. So I bring these issues up only to serve as a kind of an example of how we now approach a subject and what are the kinds of contemporary lenses through which one would approach the study of a field today. I could do what I did with readings on the temple. But as I was saying, the other 4 volumes in the series have endeavored a similar way of looking at core chapters and the ways in which a subject has been presented till now to be able to question how we have received Indian culture. My first opportunity really today, taking this podium at the IIC, to thank all of you. This is my first opportunity to do so, and to acknowledge all of your help in getting Marg to where it is. And I think the first person I'd like to remember with tremendous gratitude is Kapila Vatsayan, who isn't with us here today, but was a trustee of Marg and instrumental in creating not just this institution of the IIC, but also in guiding Marg all of these years. Geeta Kapoor is over here, our former trustee, and my deep indebtedness goes to you for upholding the values that you have for Marg. Jyotendra Jain, who has literally guided me into this position and helped me as my co-editor for many years and even brought me here to Delhi in the first instance. I thank you very deeply from the bottom of my heart. And Latika Gupta, I hope she's here somewhere, oh, there she is, who was our associate editor, who really gave me the confidence to be able to carry on with Marg all of this time. And when I was invited back to be its editor, it really meant a lot to be able to chat with you and try and get you back at least, however feebly. Today's volume on textiles owes a lot also to the guidance that Monisha Ahmed lent Marg as its associate editor for many years. Because Monisha was deeply committed to the subject of textiles and invited Mayank Mansingh Kaul to do an important volume a few years back on reassessing Indian textiles. And that really was the lift-off point for the historiography that we are able to present under the able stewardship of Abigail McGowan today. I know the audience, I gather, somewhere has Janet Rizvi here, and I'd like to thank her very much for writing one of Marg's great bestsellers. Her volume on Pashmina and all the work that you have done on Ladakh all of these years really has been wonderful, and it went into multiple editions, and it's very good to be able to carry your contribution in this particular historic reader. And that brings me to introduce you and not stand in the way of today's panel and its discussion. Let me first begin by introducing Laila Tayyibji, who really needs no introduction to the audience of Delhi at all. Designer, writer, chairperson of Dastakar, Laila has been working with grassroots artisans all over India for the past 45 years. Many of her most rewarding projects involved creating a new livelihood through craft and for pastoral and marginalized rural communities. Bonded labor in Bihar, displaced villages in Ranthambore, tribals in Odisha and Karnataka, victims of insurgency in Kashmir. She's worked with all of them and worked out a practical mechanism for them to be able to. So it's not just documentation, but here is a practitioner. Laila studied art in Baroda and in Japan, worked as a freelance designer in textiles, graphics, interiors, and in theater. And she has been a very eloquent writer in the field all of these years. And so it's a great privilege to be able to introduce you to her today. Ritu Sethi, or should I say Dr. Ritu Sethi, is the founder trustee of the Craft Revival Trust and editor of Global Inch, Journal of Intangible Cultural Heritage. She also oversees the Asia Inch Encyclopedia on the traditional arts, crafts, textiles of South Asia. And this is a growing archive which is increasingly becoming digitized and is becoming a very important publishing platform and repository for work being done in the field of Indian crafts. Her research interests examine aspects of pre- and post-colonial histories of the arts, textiles, and the handmade, and their links to the modern and contemporary. She's authored and edited several publications, and I'm not going to read out which ones because they'll come up in the conversation with Abigail. And I'm going to also introduce you to Ashdeen Lilawala. Thank you very much for being here with us. He's a textile designer and has been particularly known for his work with the Parsi Gara weaving tradition, embroidery tradition. He worked with the UNESCO Parzol project, where all of this was documented first. He's a product of NID himself. And this kind of work that has been done once again in the revival has to also be done with awareness of the history. And so here is another key example of how the sociological history of a particular embroidery tradition intersects with the ethics of its revivalism and the creation of a new market today. So it's great to be able to welcome you too. And that brings me to introduce you to Abigail McGowan. Abigail is Professor of History and Associate Dean in the College of Arts and Sciences at the University of Vermont in the United States. She is a historian of South Asian material culture in the late colonial period and has published widely on craft development, the gendered politics of consumption, design history, textiles, domesticity, housing, retail, and domestic furnishings in India. Her book projects have been exploring how changing ideas about home and the domestic space have shaped the city of Bombay, and how the iconic Bombay firm, Kamdar Limited, traces a history of mid-century interior design in India. I think that's her current work that you're working on. She's previously worked on the history of Indian textiles and its development during the national movement and its link with Indian politics. And I've had very profitable conversations with her in the process of working with her as the general editor and inviting her to be able to work on this volume, not merely because of the intellectual acumen that she has shown but the alacrity with which she is being able to, the decisiveness and alacrity with which she has worked has spoilt us. Honestly, it has spoilt all of us. And were it that more guest editors could do it as professionally and efficiently as you did. Thank you very much. May I please ask you to come up? Thanks.
I wanted to start off with just a brief sense of how the journal came together, how the issue came together, what the principles were that I was using to pull out articles from it. Working with 75 years of the archives of MARG is a problem of wealth, right? The numbers of amazing articles, the numbers of amazing authors who have contributed over the years to document different traditions, to trace out histories of really dynamic change over time, to think about the role of patronage, government patronage, private patronage, etc. So in thinking about how to put this article and these articles together into a coherent whole, I very much started from the ways that MARG had organized its approaches to textiles. Those tended to focus on particular techniques, particular traditions, the great Pashmina shawl book, or the special issues on kalamkari, special issues on handloom, special issues on embroidery, etc. But none of the focus on a particular tradition really captured to me what I saw as the key interventions that MARG has made. Interventions that help us to think critically about where we are, and that by thinking through them can bring together what it means to work in textiles broadly and what that has looked like and how that has changed over 75 years. As a historian, I'm interested in the question of change over time, and that was something that was amazing to trace through these articles in particular. MARG makes a really signature contribution in asking for a new history of textiles to be written after independence. That was not a major focus in the pre-independence moment. but also in asking us to think about the history of MARG, what it does, how it operates, what interventions it makes, and what interventions it does not make. And so reading through these 75 years of all these fabulous things, thinking about the ways in which the questions we have asked of textiles over time has changed, and in interesting ways. Questions about what textiles are worthy of attention, and who we think is worthy of telling those stories. Questions about, again, where traditions are revealed and what traditions, what geographies are brought forward in that. But then also questions about how and why textiles are seen as mattering to questions of identity, to questions of politics, to things like that. So again, I was interested in the questions of bringing into the issue things that I thought helped reveal the way that MARG had really historicized textiles, but also brought a new complexity to the studies in ways that were really singular for a journal. Questions in particular about mobility and intersection. Again, in the era of geographic indicators, thinking through histories of interchange, intersection that are geographic, Persian influences on traditions in Ahmedabad, new influences from Bengal moving up into Assam, etc. Intersections and mobilities that are visual, things moving from painting into textiles, from textiles into architecture, and vice versa. And then things that were technical, the ways in which different tools and techniques move from one place to the other. I was also interested in prioritizing the question of identities. For whom have textiles mattered? How have they expressed, challenged, been able to develop new kinds of identities, and then for whom are handmade textiles not part of a project of identity? When and who gets access to that? Finally, the question of power, and I think this is one that the sort of agenda of the last 10 years has asked us to think about more specifically and more critically. Who controls textile production and who speaks for textile knowledge, authority, et cetera? And the ways in which, in many ways, those questions of authority and power have broadened, but in many ways they also remain relatively narrow. So again, if one of the questions is, how do we learn about textiles? How do these questions of identity and mobilities and power and politics and privilege help us think about the story of textiles? I also wanted to think about the ways in which MARG itself intervened in and helped put those agendas on the table. And again, I think the sort of speakers we have today will help us bring out all of these themes. One of the things is that, again, remembering all that MARG did, and with so many of you involved in the journal over the years, the ways in which MARG transformed the ways we have thought about and studied and written about textiles is really worth pausing and remembering. Most specifically by putting MARG in conversation, on the same platform as a journal that was fundamentally dealing with modern architecture, miniature painting, sculpture, all of the fine arts. And again, bringing textiles into the realm of art history was something that MARG was devoted to from the beginning. And I think that's a signal contribution. Again, bringing the question of historical change as a dynamic, ongoing set of interventions, that was something MARG has been invested broadly. Certainly the ways in which MARG from its early days invested in the folk. If we think about pre-independence writings about textiles, they tended to focus on courtly production, elite traditions only, the focus on folk embroideries, rural traditions, more everyday use of textiles, and handloom production broadly. That was something MARG brought to the table. And then one of the themes that I think we've seen from the beginning to sort of forward is this idea of bringing tradition and innovation into the table in a shared conversation. It was not, in a lot of pre-independence writings, there was a great tradition, it has declined, and now things are terrible. Certainly the acknowledgement of challenges and problems facing all kinds of handmade textiles has remained, but being able to say, okay, here's the challenges and here's where people are innovating. Here are the deep roots and here's what people are doing now, and the people who are leading that in all those things. If those are some of the signal contributions, it's also then worth thinking about the ways in which there are absences, and this gets back to Naman's point about what has not been done. I think one of the key for me has been the ways in which MARG, like so much of our writing about crafts broadly, tends to focus on tradition, not people, and the ways in which there are relatively few named artisans in the pages of Marg or many other journals. Not entirely true, lots of exceptions to this rule, but as a sense of to whom is the authority of and the sort of ability to speak for granted, it tends to be to particular people who are not the artisans on that level. And again, in that sense, we have great stories of Kamala Devi Chattopadhyay, we have great stories of Martin Singh and what Ritu Kumar has done, etc. But we don't necessarily have the embroiderers or the weavers or those stories that have come in. The second thing that I think is fascinating to think about is the ways in which Marg has been interested in objects rather than use. And again, fabulous great examples to the contrary in thinking about the sort of ethnographic intervention that starts in the 1970s, by which there's a much stronger investment in the cultures and communities and reasons why people choose X versus Y. And this is both in folk traditions, but also in who's wearing what kind of sari blouse in the 19th century in elite Calcutta society. The third thing, which I always think is worth drawing attention to, is the ways in which Gandhi does not figure in the story of textiles in Marg. And again, I think this is a sort of reflects the ways in which Marg took a very different approach. It took an investment in skill, achievement, advanced design, not in the simple and the everyday. So again, thinking about the ways in which we come to terms with these different strands of intervention in textiles. And again, the point is not that Marg was either the ideal way to study textiles or the ideal way not to study textiles, but instead by looking backwards to figure out what are the blinkers we have had on, what are the amazing insights that came early, what are the ways in which Marg itself has shaped this field, but also both for good and for maybe some of the problems that have come, allows us to ask different questions about the present, about where we're going, what those roots have been, but also where we're going forward. And it's with that sort of going forward that I'm going to invite the people we're all relying on to give us the answers to come and join me on the stage so we can start the conversation portion of this. Think about the ways in which, again, we as a contemporary person in the fashion field who is deeply rooted in the history, to think back to 19th and 20th century as textiles as a history themselves of fashion. In what ways we can see what we now think of as a traditional embroidery tradition, itself reflecting new influences, new designs. So again, how do you historicize the fashion of something that we now think of as traditional?
So I specialize in Parsi embroidery, and the idea was when the trade started between the Parsis of India with China, they kind of found these fantastic textiles which were being done for the European market, and they kind of adapted it to a sari. So we have a story which I've heard in Navsari and other places where the traders who had started traveling, they saw these textiles and asked for their wives for a sari to be made for 6 meters. And so the first few pieces we have in embroidery are completely embroidered on all 4 sides, because the embroiderers in China did not know how the sari was draped or how it was worn. And this is somewhere around the trade started, and the first traders went in 1756. And we know that the first woman who traveled to Canton, which was the port of trade, was in 1866, Putli by Davar. And I think very slowly and initially there was intervention. And when the traders kind of saw the fashion and how the costume was used or how the textiles was used, that's when the intervention started coming in. And it's interesting that as a craft, it kind of grew over the years, and there were different ideas and different kind of traditions which mixed to amalgamate into this craft. So there was definitely the Chinese or the Oriental inspiration. There were Persian motifs which were adapted. Then obviously it was an Indian garment, so they kind of used Indian elements in it. And because there was a European, British, we had baskets and bows and various other influences. So the craft was always kind of growing, always kind of amalgamating different ideas. And I think in early 20th century, due to the Swadeshi movement and the Khadi independence coming, there was war in China, the trade kind of slowly fizzled out. So there have been influences throughout the history of the craft. And we kind of always look at it as a set of tradition. It's kind of an aesthetic rather than this is what defines Parsi Gara. Or for me, I've always looked at the craft as an aesthetic and kind of then use certain elements in important ideas and kind of taken it forward. And the craft was largely reverence to nature. So that's what one of the key elements we still use. And that's where we kind of see the connection even today. So today, most people who see a sari with a border and it has birds and flowers, they tend to say it's a gara. So it's kind of that tradition which has carried on over the years. And today, even when I started my label 10 years ago, I was very sure that I didn't want to copy or slavishly just create the same saris. So the idea was to bring in some innovation in terms of fabric, in terms of color, in terms of even just using different sizing, and see how the placement of the pallu could change, how different, and today women are draping, and the younger girls who buy from us are draping saris very differently, and are kind of looking at it as a fashion garment rather than just a sari. So that's where I think that it's still in transition, and I hope it stays in transition.
Excellent, thank you. Next one, I'm gonna turn to Ritu to ask the question about history and change in a different moment, thinking about the period right after independence when so many of the big institutions and organizations devoted to bringing textiles to national audiences take off. Can you build on this argument to think about the ways in which there was an attempt to both harness ongoing change and recognize broad influences, but also to honor tradition? What were the key interventions that people were making in that moment right after independence?
Well, that's a really tough question, and I would need the whole day to answer it in detail, but I'm going to try and make it brief. What is very interesting is that in 1950, there was a great recognition that these village industries and these art manufacturers needed to be looked at very carefully because they were the mainstay of the country. There were very few mills, there was not enough cloth to go around. It was a very difficult period. So what I actually did, because I was actually trying to work on this history for a particular paper I was writing, was I looked at the Planning Commission documents, and they helped me trace, very interestingly, as to the thinking behind how policy was made around this. And it was such a small polity at that time that policy depended on the few people that were picked by the powers to be. So Pandit Nehru at that time chose two people who worked under the Ministry of Commerce and Industry. And of course, everyone knows their names: Pupul Jekar, who looked after handlooms, and Kamla Devi Chattopadhyay, who was in charge of the handicrafts. And their influence was huge, because while we look at them in their later avatars and we think of them as civil activists, they were actually government employees. So that is a remarkable twist, that within government, they were able to bring about change. And what is the change they brought about? So I looked at what were the amounts that were budgeted for this sector. And literally till the late 1970s and 80s, it was a rising graph, which showed how important this area was for development. There were some very interesting things that happened at that time. We keep bemoaning that there are no numbers and there's such little data. But in 1960, and that is something every student of art history and textile history and craft history will always refer to, is that along with the census, they also did a census of the crafts. And those monographs that are really hard to get, half of them are not even digitized, but if you can get your hands on them, really give you a sense of what was happening in the country at that time in this area. And what is equally shocking is that in some areas where there were 50,000 to 1 lakh people working, it is now often an endangered tradition. So, it gives you a moment of pause. So obviously some things went right because we are so vibrant and visible at the moment, but some things went horribly wrong. So some of the things that went right were, I think, it's something you mentioned, that very rarely does one see the name of the maker. And that is the giving of honors to people who were themselves producing things. And while we look at it now as, oh, it's done, oh yeah, he's got an award, it was actually a turning point in my view, because you knew them by name. This is the person who works there. That was one. And what saddens me at the same time is, I was actually, for some other reason, looking at the latest annual report of the Ministry of Textiles, and I found over there, it said, our policies have remained unchanged since independence. And I thought, oh my goodness, the world has moved on, we have moved on. I mean, is this a moment of pride, or is it something that we should beat ourselves with? And there was a time of change in the 1980s when Mrs. Jaker was called the Tsarina of culture. And when NID was set up in 1960, and when NIFT came up, and I looked at old documents to see what was the reaction to NIFT. And it was like, do we need design? We are such a poor country. This is the last thing we need. But that is when things started changing. And these were all, and I repeat, it was a far-sighted government and a bureaucracy that backed these measures. And then, of course, was the Festival of India. And while we know of just a few names from the festival, and we keep repeating them, it couldn't have been done without the entire network of Viva service centers and the number of people that came out of that ferment. And again, I feel so sad, because when we say artisans' names are not mentioned, hundreds of designers, we don't know who they were. Where did they vanish? How could such a big thing have been done when we know of 5, 6, perhaps 10 names? Where are the rest? But what was amazing at that time is that, unlike the remarkable work that people like Ashdeen and others do, this was work that was done by government, and therefore it was available for all. You may say it was available for copying, but really it was available to the entire community. There was no copyright. So when Isse Miyake came in and worked with Ikat, those Ikat designs were available to all. So these are some of the things that went off very well. Of course, as you know, we have no census on the numbers, though we keep saying they're the second largest, but I will stop here.
Thank you. That then gives us a chance to turn it to Lila to think about the contemporary moment in terms of, again, this withdrawal of government from textiles broadly, but crafts more generally, and the ways in which there are certain opportunities that have come with that, but obviously challenges also. I love the idea that the policy hasn't changed since 1947. It's just a little terrifying.
Well, I think the biggest change really has been that the craft sector and the textile handloom, we are talking of handlooms here and handcrafted textiles, has in a way freed itself from the need of government patronage. And I think that it caused a lot of disruption when the allocations in the 5-year plans and the various budgets decreased for the craft sector, decreased and decreased. But it was a challenge, and I think the sector responded to it. I think it's very easy to talk about all the terrible things that have happened to the handloom sector, to the textile sector, and they certainly, like all sectors of the economy, had a terrible time during COVID, terrible time during demonetization, a terrible time when the really careless imposition of GST was done. So they have suffered a lot, and if you ask them that, is there anything positive, perhaps they might not themselves realize that some positive things have happened. And one of those, in a very curious way, has been the withdrawal of government patronage and the simultaneous arrival of the internet, which has freed craftspeople from being dependent on often very ignorant or very oppressive or very manipulative middlemen or government policies and so on, and having to take things in their own hands. And it has given them direct access to both their consumers and also the lifestyles of people for whom they cater. And quite extraordinary things have happened as a result. I mean, all over India you travel and you see weavers themselves now with their own visiting cards, with their own brands, with their own things. They've got access to Pinterest and Google, and they look at what is going on in the world. One of my favorite examples is my friend, a young Khatri Ajrak printer from Kutch, Sohail, who saw Jackson Pollock on the internet and produced the most extraordinary range of Ajrak saris, in which the pallos and the borders were absolutely traditional Ajrak, but in the middle there were these splashes of color, and absolutely stunning. And that's just one example of many. And I think Ashdeen's shirt is an example, again, of a painter, of a craftsman who's painted and block printed and done things. So that is a freeing. And the fact that saris today are developed without necessarily having the ritual border and the pallo and the thing in these set ways, and they're doing different layouts. Not always brilliantly successful, but at least they're innovating, and innovation being done by the people whose tradition it is, not by some alien person going there and saying, okay, do what. There are some terrible things that have happened. I saw a Kanjivaram sari the other day, which had 15 profiles of the Prime Minister with different headgear on it. Extraordinary feat of weaving, but, you know, absolutely grotesque. But by and large, on the whole, great things have happened. And when we sometimes rather gloomily say that, oh, you know, I remember what beautiful saris my mother or my grandmother had and why these things are not there. I mean, let's also just think of all the new developments in textiles. I mean, my mother wore only saris, but she didn't have access to an Ajrak sari, a Bomkai sari, a Begumpuri sari, or this wonderful innovation of Bujori saris that have come up. The fact that today in Bengal and in Andhra Pradesh, people are making extraordinary jamdani again, almost as good as what was made in Dhaka. And they could do even that if they got the right cotton, which unfortunately is still in the hands of the government. So many things like that, I think, have happened. And the whole sector is, I think, exploding. And young people are discovering again also that, oh, Indian traditional handloom is not boring, is not, you know, something which belongs to grandmother's generation, but is exciting and new. And I think Instagram has done a lot for that, because people are modeling these saris. I think on Facebook there's something like 52 different sari groups, and everyone is wearing these saris, and people come to the Daskar Bazaar. There was a young girl the other day who came and said, ma'am, you know, I've seen saris, I want to buy a sari. And I think we forget sometimes that the mother of that girl actually didn't wear saris. She wore salwar kameez or she wore churidars. So they haven't grown up with that. And she was completely mesmerized when she saw the range. Because for people who are used to going to a mall and seeing, you know, maybe say 6 designs in different colorways and different sizes, to have this explosion of design and color and motive that is accessible to all of us, I think actually we are on the threshold of something very exciting happening.
I think to add to Laila's point, there is this large democratization of which has happened through Instagram and social media. And today a weaver can post a picture which he's taken and created something, and he can charge as well as somebody, the designer is charging. Today, I have lots of young embroiderers who send me pictures saying, we have done this, how do you think it is? Can you give us your feedback? So they do have connect directly with designers. They do have connect with their audience. And as Laila mentioned, today the younger generation has gone definitely away from the long form of writing, but everything is bite-sized and it's with graphics and there is a video with it. But today it's amazing that weavers are making videos of their weaving, showing details, explaining ideas, their idea behind something, and you can create a story or educate somebody through a 60-second reel, rather than them reading a 60-page book or something which they don't want to. So there is that democratization, and there is definitely information which is being uploaded rapidly for a new audience. And I think many of these girls who come to us and many other labels, they today have a checklist. I want one Bandhani sari, I want one Kanjivaram, I want one Gara in my trousseau. And they're not buying 50 saris from Banaras or whatever, but they want one good one. They're ready to spend the money. They're ready to, style it differently and see how it goes.
I want to follow up on the question of media. Actually, leave that one with you, because I think that if we think about MARG as a media intervention into textiles, one of the ways in which social media does it is it democratizes, but of course it also homogenizes in ways, the Bollywoodization of all textiles in one thing. So I'd love to hear all of your thoughts about where that balance is coming and how where the homogenization is winning and where the diversification is winning. Because again, I think there's some of both going on right now.
Definitely. There's levels of good work, means as Laila mentioned, there's terrible work happening, there's good work happening, but it's all out there for people to consume. And one good part about India is that whatever you do, there is an audience. So there is this massive market out there, and slowly people are tapping into what they feel is right for them. And I think going ahead, there will be slightly culling of what is not necessary or what is not good, and what is well produced, or what it will come out. So, but it will be a slow process, and I think, like she said, we are on the cusp of making it available for everybody.
What do you think would help to make that get us over the cusp?
I think you do have to tap back to history in some ways, and that's where MARG and many other publications come in, because you can have something which is glossed up and fancy, but beyond a certain point, you do need the depth, you need the history, you need to know what you're talking about. So that, I think, will bring the change.
Ritu, can I get you to talk about the online resources that you've been working on in terms of, again, how do they balance that question of, again, deep diversity of many, many local things, and yet the ways in which sometimes that then becomes maybe a shopping list of I need this and this and this. Are there limitations of that, or what are the ways in which that's been productive?
Well, this is again a complicated question, because when we started work, it really bothered us that books were hard to get. You had to go to libraries. This was in the late 1990s. And I felt that there is so much that we don't know, that if we were to start an encyclopedia, which would just perhaps even just have 5 lines on what arts, crafts, and textiles exist across South Asia, because India is the big daddy of the area, so you can imagine what's happening across in other regions, that it would help people move further and also create a bibliography for those who are interested beyond those 4 lines and who are willing to hunt down books. This was before archives.org and all the selling that is going on. And when I started work, I thought, okay, we are going to finish in a year's time. But hey, it's a work in progress, because that is how vibrant this area is and how many skills, techniques, and traditions there are. And also, what is heritage? For us, it is something more than 500 years old. But what about something that's 40 years old? That too is somebody's heritage and needs some attention being paid to. What is the meaning of misusing of the term? Like, you go to Aurangabad and it's a land of Himru, but there are 2 Himru weavers left there. So what is a Himru you're buying? So therefore we set up another online platform called Global Inch, where these issues could be discussed and talked about so that people got to understand what was happening. Then it started disturbing me when so much information was available online and a lot of it was a bit dodgy. But I had a very interesting conversation with this very interesting young man called Nitin Pamnani, who runs one of the biggest websites now, online marketplaces on arts and crafts, called iTokri, and I'm sure most people here must be knowing about it. And he said to me, when I said I'm a bit disturbed by all this, he said, don't be, because we have people who have never known what a craft is, who have grown up in a mill-made or a world where they have gone to their local markets and shopped. You don't know how lucky we are to have this world open to us. So what people want is a story. They want to know why they're paying a little bit more, even if the story is wrong. So it is fulfilling a need somewhere. And at the end, don't forget, there is that human being who is making it. So in order for you not to just look at the art history aspect of it, look at how it's and why it is continuing. It is continuing because of the person on the loom, who's block printing, embroidering in some small place somewhere. So the more information, and somewhere, if you're interested, you'll actually get to the right place because it's available.
One of the things I think we've all seen and experienced is the ways in which a new person will come in and they say, oh, I discovered this tradition, I'm going to document it, and then I'll bring it out forward. And that unawareness of either the history that has been there or then many other peoples that haven't. I've been struck in the ways in which there are such deep networks of people who work in crafts, but there's also people, the ways in which those networks don't come in. So where are people tapping into those networks, and who is still being left out? Where are we not sort of making sure there's a coherent conversation by which when you think about Parsi Gara embroidery, you sort of have a common place to leave? And Laila, maybe I'll turn to you for this one. Again, who is left out of this story of handmade textiles? For whom are they not, is it not something they can tap into? And what are the barriers to that?
Well, I think language is, of course, one of the things that the people who do or make are very often not the people who have access to the literature or the things. And that is in spite of the digital media, that so many extraordinary documentations are either coffee table books, which are completely out of the economic range of a craftsperson, or even a local NGO who works with craftspeople. And also that there is a tendency sometimes when new developments and things happen, of people being rather guarded and possessive about it, that, oh, my craftspeople, or my discovery, or my development. And that is because they don't have the confidence to realize that in this extraordinary, huge country, there's room for everybody. But I think it's changing, and I think that people are realizing that actually shared knowledge results to greater productivity, and that it's very short-sighted to hang on to your knowledge. I think that a lot of awareness building needs to happen, because this is a sector that in itself does not have the money to promote itself, to advertise, to buy space on even a newspaper or television or whatever. And so that becomes rather limited. I think that India needs an extraordinary campaign, the way that Incredible India did for tourism, and where all kinds of small places in India suddenly became tourist attractions because people read about them, and it was not just the Golden Triangle of Agra, Delhi, Jaipur. So I think if we could have a campaign like that for craft, and in which obviously I include handloom textiles, it would be amazing. I'm always surprised. I'm often asked to speak when the first years come into NIFT or NID or whatever, and asked to give an introduction to Indian textiles. And I can see these young kids who come from small town India, and they look at this, white-haired lady in a sari, and they say, oh God, this is going to be so boring, I mean, what on earth do I have to listen to this for? And then the minute you start flashing slides on the screen of the extraordinary colors and designs and the huge diversity of Indian textiles, they all wake up and they realize, wow, and then at the end they come to, ma'am, can we come and work, but where can I find that, and whatever. And it suddenly hits them that India, trying to catch up with the rest of the world in many ways, has something that no one else in the world has. And if you're a young person who's creative and entrepreneurial, this is somewhere where they ought to be.
I think we're going to run out of time. I want to open up to people, but I have one final question, which is about this, the sort of young generation of designers. As we think about the relationship between design and crafts, there's been many bad examples and many amazing examples. What would the three of you like to see the ideal example be? What would the model be? And since you get to be a model, you have the microphone first.
I think there is the fashion and craft, there has been an intersection in the last few years, and a lot of prominent designers are also now tapping into craft skills which exist. So rather than building something or kind of starting something new or not sharing, they are tapping or working with already existing craft villages or craft techniques. And so there is a new sense of collaboration which is happening. And I can say from my example that we collaborated with Ekaya, which is a producer for Banarsi saris, and we kind of gave designs which were inspired by the Parsi Gara tradition. And I was once shouted by a very purist historian who said, you will kill the whole Gara industry, but that didn't happen, touch wood. But so we have recently collaborated with a label, Kanakwali, and done embroidery on kanji saris. So there is a lot of collaboration happening, and I think young designers going ahead will have to use resources and pull in and kind of tap into these bigger craft sectors and kind of get their fabric woven in, say, Bengal, do the embroidery in Kutch, do something. And there are many, many labels who are doing it. There are labels like Raw Mango, Pero, various others who are kind of tapping into different sectors in every season. So I think there is a good mix happening, and I think younger designers will also have to find these kind of smaller fields or craft enclaves to tap into.
I look at it a bit differently. I would look at it as a division between the use of skills and the use of a tradition. If you're using a skill of block printing, as an example, and you give your own design, you're using the skill. But if you use an ajrak or you use a tradition, then what I would like to see is the designer do micro co-creations, X with Y. Why is one bigger than the other? Why is there this imbalance when you're using your design skills, but you're using the other person's tradition? So that is what I would like to see. In all the many exhibitions, that's the first thing I look at. Is the name of the weaver here? And if it isn't, it's like, perhaps next year.
Well, I think too that, I'm echoing what Ritu's saying, that it has to be a partnership. And unfortunately, it does happen that a lot of young, very peppy, quite creative and ambitious young designers or design students go to an area almost feeling that they're doing seva. by working in a rural area or working with poor people. And they also feel that they have come to give their knowledge and that craftspeople are just a passive pair of skilled hands. And I think they have to realize that it's a partnership and it will not be successful unless you give equal weightage. Also, in this very fast-moving time of ours, nobody gives enough time to the preparation, to doing the research, to doing the documentation. And when they arrive in a craft cluster, very often they really don't know what is there, what the skill is, what the technique is, what the tradition is, and they pull out some idea that they have in their heads which might not be appropriate. And they don't even know that, for instance, when you're doing embroidery, it's much easier to do curved designs because the needle and the thread follow that way. But when you're working on a loom, it's a more geometric, mathematical kind of structure. So they are failures. And craftspeople, I mean, rural India is so hospitable, they're so kind, they're so sort of warm, that they'll never tell one of these young designers that really what you're producing is shit. And
That's
so
a terrible idea. Don't do it.
that's a terrible waste of money and resources, and both sides get frustrated because the craftsperson does think that designer from the city is a magician who's going to wave a magic wand and make them lots of money. And the designer does think that, wow, you know, this is a chance for me to fulfill all my things. And then they go away, and quite often they come and say, oh, we never want to work with craftspeople again because it's just so frustrating. And craftspeople tell us all the time, Benji, designer mat bhejna, you know. So somewhere, I think that partnership and making people understand that both of you have strengths and skills, and for God's sake, share them.
And again, whatever that partnership can be.
I'm sorry to do this. I mean, these are fascinating conversations, but we have the auditorium only for a limited amount of time. Thank you to our panel, especially Abigail McGowan, because she's really spearheaded this entire magazine for us. Laila Taibji, Ritu Sethi, always a pleasure. Ashdeen, it was so lovely to hear of how tradition has never been static, and that's something we should be thinking about. Acknowledging the makers for a change, I think I need to thank everyone who's worked on the magazine, including our wonderful designer. I don't see her here, but Yamini Gandhi designed all the layouts, and she's designed the beautiful cover. The cover is also a photograph by Brianna Blasco, and that's she's done an entire series on textiles and dance. It's evocative, it's beautiful. Please see if you can catch a copy there. I'd also like to thank Naman, because I think we keep forgetting to thank him every now and then. But so Naman has explained what we've been trying to do with these 75 years of Marg readers. And it's been an education not only for the people who have been reading it, but for us who have been making it. Because it's so easy to take it for granted that this tradition is there, it's been documented, but to look through the archive and realize the wealth of voices and ideas that have come, and we're so lucky that we have some of those voices in the audience today. And I hope that a lot more of you are going to continue to write for Marg, and I hope some new writers also emerge from this auditorium and write for Marg in the future. Now, I need to do this. I'm going to thank all the supporters who have made this magazine possible. BNP Paribas, TVS Motor Companies Limited, Lafayette Designs Private Limited, the government of West Bengal, and a special thank you to IIC for really hosting us, for giving us this wonderful space, and for all of you for joining us on this cold winter, Delhi winter. Well, maybe it's not cold for you guys, but it's cold for me, and I'm so grateful that you all turned up and made it such a warm, lovely evening. Thank you, everyone, and enjoy your night.